What happens when law, business, and life collide? Each week on Lead Counsel, your host Tom Tona will take a deep dive into topics related to the law, the business of law, and life. There will be insightful discussions with industry insiders, experts, and thought leaders making significant contributions and meaningful differences in their fields of expertise. Tom is the founder and managing attorney at TonaLaw. He has been a practicing attorney since 1994 and the leader of TonaLaw since it opened in 2001. The goal of this podcast is to provide you with free information on law and the business of law, and to give you actionable tools related to each of these areas. Now, here's Tom.
All right. Welcome back to the Lead Counsel Podcast. This is your host, Tom Tona, here with Joyful Jules in 2024. Welcome to 2024, Jules. How you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well.
Yeah. Good start to the year so far?
Yeah, wonderful. Can't
All
complain.
Right. Awesome. And we're also joined today by Ed Alexander. Ed is a business attorney out of Florida with a really interesting practice niche that I'm excited to talk to him about. Ed, what's going on, buddy?
Everything's great. Yep. Really just enjoying it. It's actually a little bit better here than it is by you because it's so cold by you, but it's still cold here. It's like 54, which is unusual for us.
That is cold for Florida.
A little bit about Ed really quick. He's an avid athlete. I know that personally, and we'll get a little bit into that. He does a lot of hard stuff on the athletic side, but he's got a really interesting business niche, and he's been doing this since 1993. So we're around the same age, I would assume, Ed, because I've been doing it since 1994.
We are.
Ed is the author of several key books, both of which I have on my bookshelf, even though I'm not a Florida attorney. The first one is The Guide to Selling Your Florida Law Practice, and the second one is the Florida Business Contracts Handbook. All right, let's jump right in, right? Ed, how you doing today, Ed?
I am doing great. This is a wonderful day.
Awesome. So give me a little bit of background on you. I did not know, and I learned about you through the questionnaire that we sent out, that you're actually a systems engineer and a tech guy. Tell me how you made the leap from systems engineer and tech to law, and what does that look like right now for your practice?
So, I originally am from Long Island. So I actually had gone to school and got a great job there as a systems engineer. I actually went to tech school, right? And then came out of tech school and got a systems engineer job up there in Hauppauge, actually.
Oh, nice.
Believe it or not.
That's
and
where I'm from.
Oh, there you go. And so it was great. I had a great time. And, the one thing, I was actually one of the engineers that the sales guys could actually take out to prospects and to customers, and I could talk to them. And so I started going out on all these, different deals, and I would go with the sales guys. I loved it. I thought it was fantastic going out there and talking to people and putting deals together. And then I went to the place I was working and I said, "Hey, I want to be a sales guy." And they said, No, we don't hire engineers as sales guys. So I said, okay. I went and found a different job and product marketing manager in Bohemia at a company no longer there, but Symbol Technologies, but it was a big company at the time.
Yeah. I know Symbol. Yeah.
That was a fantastic run. I mean, 7 years, it was wonderful. But in the process of that, I actually interfaced with in-house counsel. And so I would go do deals and I would interface with in-house counsel. And I decided, hey, this is pretty cool. Let me go to law school. Maybe I'll do what they do. And that's exactly what I did. I went to 4 years of night school over at Toro. And in those days, Toro was in Huntington. So we were just down the road from one another, I guess, right?
Right.
You were at Hofstra.
Yep.
So, and then when I came out, I worked there for a little while. They put me in the patent department. And that's basically sitting in a 12 by 12 room and writing patent applications all day. And so my brain was starting to melt and I decided it was time to find a new job. And my wife said, well, if you're going to find a new job, let's go to Florida where it's nice and warm.
So interesting. Patent work is where you would hear most engineer background attorneys end up. And you're a patent holder as well, right? You hold a patent?
Yeah, I'm an inventor on a patent that was actually assigned to Symbol way back in the day.
Oh, so you're like a gazillionaire. You're just doing this law stuff for fun.
That's exactly right. No, they give you a nice little $500 check, which, go out and have a good dinner. Here you go.
That's it?
That's it.
Do you know what's funny? I put in a patent application years ago after spending $10,000 to a law firm to do it, and it got denied. And I was like, I'm done. I can't compete with the big boys. I'm not wasting my time on it. It was just a distraction. But I don't think a lot of people understand that it's still key. You got to bring it to market, right? Like what we were talking about,
right.
Even with the software platform I developed or somebody you were talking to. It's great to have a software platform, but unless you're selling it,
right.
How
do you monetize it?
How do you monetize it, right? It's a big thing that people skip over. You don't just get rich because you hold a patent. You don't get rich because because you invent software, you got to sell it.
That's exactly right. And in this case, the patent was right in line with what Symbol did, and it was basically, I developed it because of the work that I was doing for Symbol. So it was rightfully theirs. And actually, the coolest thing is I got called as a witness in a patent infringement suit. And so this is well after I had moved to Florida and I was a lawyer down here and everything. So it was really cool for me because I'd never been in a lawsuit as a party or as a witness before. And so I really got to see kind of a completely different perspective than trying to do it from the litigator standpoint.
It's funny that you say that because who was I talking to? Oh, I was doing Chris Early's podcast, The Early Show, and we talked about the effects of meditation and rhythmic breathing. And he said, how have you deployed that? Because I'm a big meditator. I do it religiously every morning, 20 minutes. But how I deployed it was I was a party to a lawsuit and I have only that fight or fight reflex, not fight or flight, fight or fight. And in order to keep my adrenaline levels in check, I was doing that rhythmic breathing. As a party to a lawsuit or a witness to a lawsuit, it's different than being the lawyer to a lawsuit, right?
Oh, completely. Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with you on that. So in your spare time, what are you doing?
Well, I love the biking. So we did in November, I did a cross Florida tour. So we went from Tampa to St. Petersburg and then up and all the way across to Titusville. So it's about, I don't know, what did it end up being, like 180 miles, maybe something like that, maybe a little bit more. Yeah, it was a nice little tour. So we did it over a number of days and it was great because you really get to see all of Florida when you do that tour. It's definitely worth it.
And your wife bikes also?
She bikes, but she did not do a tour with me. That's not her gig.
Okay.
She wouldn't sign up for the 180 miles.
Right, 180 miles. That's a lot of biking. This is why, by the way, you're probably in the best shape I've seen you in the 10 years I know you, right? So tell me what made you want to pivot, though. I know you said interfacing with general counsel. Most lawyers I know, if they had a tech background, would say, I want to give up the law and go into tech. And you went the other way, right? Was there one specific thing behind that?
I always went to law school with the entire expectation that I would be a business lawyer. And I took all the business classes. I did all those things. It was always in the cards for me because I just really enjoy kind of making the finances work, making the relationship work, putting all that together.
So I was wondering, obviously you said you started with patent work in New York. So how did you transition to Florida? Did you have to take the Florida bar?
It's interesting. The year I took the bar, there was a Jewish holiday for the local day. So New York had its multi-state day, then a holiday, and then the essay day. And so I went to Florida. I took the multi-state day in Florida. I took the essay day in Florida. I got on a plane. I flew to Newark, went into the city because you take it at the Javits. So at least I did because I lived on the island.
I did too.
And just went in and took the essay day and was completely and utterly exhausted. I took the train. At that time, we lived out in not Holtzville, right around Holtzville, that area there. And I'm taking the train on the Long Island Railroad. For the first time in my life, I fell asleep on the train and the conductor woke me up. So totally exhausted.
I can only imagine. And then, so what kind of law do you practice in now?
So corporate and business law, what our real emphasis is on professional service firms and the exit strategies that lawyers and CPAs, for example, have and how they can basically maximize their wealth through essentially exiting their practice.
It's so interesting.
So let's jump into that. First of all, what's the name of your law firm?
Alexander Business Law.
Okay. So for anybody in Florida, if you're an attorney listening to this and you're looking to sell your law practice or you're looking to take on a partner or somebody has proposed partnership to you, Ed Alexander should be one of your first stops, right? Do a consultation, figure out if you guys are going to move forward and just timeliness of everything. I posted something. I was thinking about a story of somebody I came into probably about 15 years ago. A attorney approached me. Attorney says, let's have dinner. We have dinner. He's just getting ousted from his 5-partner law firm. He says, I think we should partner up. And I'm like, I don't think so, because I've been known not to play well with others. And really what that translates to is there wasn't an equal footing of value in my mind, and I didn't want to lose a potential friendship over it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think too many people are afraid to consult with somebody like you, and then they jump into these things. I hear horror story after horror story of lawyers and law firms that are formed for the wrong reasons, and they take on these equity partners, and then they have to go to somebody like you to do the business divorce, which is always a nightmare.
Complete nightmare.
Right?
Absolutely.
So what are some of the unique challenges and rewards of working with law firms and business owners? And you can separate those out because there may not be that many with lawyers and law firms.
Well, I tell you, the really enjoyable part is like, let's use the example of your friend there. They come to you and they say, hey, we're going to put together a partnership. That's the first question I want to ask is, okay, so why? What is everybody bringing to the table? Because that in and of itself is going to tell you what that partnership agreement needs to look like. And they need to have a partnership agreement. And, so many times that people will come and they'll have a partnership agreement and the provisions in there will violate the ethical rules, right? They'll have a non-compete, something like that. It's just crazy, right? Or, a buyout that is really, just completely inappropriate for a law firm based on the ethical rules.
Right. So it's funny because you and I have attended some classes, right? We're going to talk about valuation in a second, but we've attended classes where they're like, look, we're not attorneys, but this is what we would recommend. Now go talk to the attorneys. And that might be an employment agreement. Well, in New York, my employment attorney is like, don't use them. They're non-binding. And in most circumstances, you're going to violate ethical rules when you're dealing with lawyers, right? So we stopped using those. And so it's very similar to what you're talking about, where you really need somebody in the location where you are to do the business deal so they know the ethical rules, the legal rules, even if you're a non-attorney, even if this is just a straight business venture.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. The employment agreement piece is interesting. I mean, I like to make sure that we have the end of relationship provision in that employment agreement. So here it's rule 4-5.8, but it's basically the rule that says if you are the lead counsel and on a case and you're leaving the firm, that you have the right to contact the client and let them know that you're leaving the firm. Well, we want to make sure that's a mutual letter that goes out. And we want to make sure that, it's pre-agreed upon what that letter is going to look like so that it's professional, so that the client understands. Now, we don't want to prevent the client from doing what they want to. We just want to make sure that everybody plays nice with one another.
Right. So in that instance, right, I have no problem with any of that stuff as long as there is a mutual consideration. Like, hey, I pay out people on a deal. If they leave, they originated cases, I'm going to pay it out on handshake, but I'm getting paid back on the same handshake, right? Like if the cases all of a sudden disappear. So it's funny that it comes up, and I was talking to somebody I was interviewing not too long ago. And this person said, I'm really struggling. I don't want to pay out my law firm on the cases. I'm like, why not? They fronted all the money. You've been there using the resources. Just pay them out. It's good business. Don't burn that bridge.
Don't burn the bridge.
You got to pay them anyway. You got to pay them anyway. And you'll consider it that you're buying you a piece and assuring future business from them.
Yeah. It's a long-term relationship.
It's a long tail game. Exactly.
Yes. So if you're looking at what the payoff is today, then that's the wrong focus, right? The focus has to be long-term. It's the same thing with partnerships, right? It's okay. Well, we're going to come together. What's the long-term arrangement that we want to have here? And how do we break up? Because at the end of the day, you're leaving that partnership. You may be leaving it when you're healthy and walking out the door and still practicing law, or you may be leaving it in another way, horizontally, right?
Right. Hopefully not. Hopefully not, but it's possible. But, you got to figure on how are we going to maintain the relationship after we're working together. Let me ask you a question, because I remember a mentor's advice. I had a mentor back in the day, and a really trusted mentor. And he basically said, because at one point I was like, some partners, blah, blah, blah. And he said, look, other than when people come directly out of school together where they both have nothing and are starting with nothing, most partnerships fail. And that's because there's usually a disparate value between one party and the other. What's one party bringing to the table? What's the other party bringing? And he said, so I just as a rule of thumb, I tell people don't do it, right? This was the advice. And it always stuck with me. Now I'm in the process of succession planning myself. I'm working with an FCFO, and we're developing a partnership track that then goes to the lawyers, right? Once we get all the concepts and who the successors are and what that looks like. But as a rule of thumb, what do you find as somebody who's in the trenches, who drafts the agreements, who does the dissolutions? Is that a good rule of thumb?
No. I disagree with that.
Okay.
So I'll say two things to that. The
salty opinion, Ed. I like it.
The first is, what is the partnership about, right? Because attorneys expect to be partners. And so there's a retention component to this. Now, they may, and I've done this for people where, they say, I need to make a partner. Okay, well, let's go back and figure out what partnership means to that attorney that's on your team. Does it mean being able to put in on their business card that they're a shareholder? Because if it does, we can do that very easily, and they're not a partner, right? And so
partner being like equity partner, right? Like use specific definitions because most of the people that listen to this are lawyers, right? Law firm.
So
lawyers.
equity, in order to hold yourself out as a partner, at least in Florida, and I believe in New York as well, you have to actually own equity in the firm. Right. So that's one thing. But if I own 99.999% of the equity of the firm and you own 0.001%, you still own equity in the firm. So you can hold yourself out as a shareholder or principal or whatever you want to hold yourself out as legitimately, but you don't get to participate in the decision making. Right. So that's one form of partnership. Now, if we're going to get together in another form of partnership, what we really need to do is get all of the expectations out on the table. Expectations are what kill relationships, right? Because oftentimes they're not stated, they're assumed. So let's get those assumed expectations out on the table. Let's get everything, even the ones that we don't necessarily know that we have, out on the table. And let's decide, does this make sense? How do we work that into our agreement? How are we going to operate together? And for lawyers, the biggest thing is the compensation plan.
Okay. So before we even get to comp, let me just say one thing. In New York, there's such a thing as non-equity partners, and it's very often not distinguished. So like I have a friend, he works for a big law firm, and I see partner. Now, this is a guy I was like, I want him on my team. I go out to lunch with him and I'm like, so what, what's this partner thing? He's like, it's not equity. I think for the attorneys in New York where you have these divisions, I wouldn't want that title other than for marketing purposes because it literally extinguishes opportunity, right? Like I hired a high-end headhunter recruiter. Hopefully they don't get mad if I use the word headhunter, but a high-end recruiter for the next 6 months. I'm looking for very specific attorneys. Right now, they're approaching people that have the partner title because in New York, this non-equity level of partnership, nobody puts non-equity partner on their LinkedIn. So I don't know. I think it's a slick way for New York attorneys to lock in partners and diminish contacts and opportunities if they're non-equity.
Can I ask a question? Because obviously both of you guys are lawyers. What is the benefits of being listed as a partner in a firm? Like, what if you're just the head attorney?
Non-equity or equity? Are we talking about equity or non-equity?
I guess both. Like, why would somebody even want to list themselves as a non-equity partner?
That's a great question. Ed, take it away. It's your area.
So you're basically able to hold yourself out to the world as a principal, right? So it carries more panache with clients and prospective clients. You can go out there and market. It is it's a title that people respect.
Okay. So I guess
for non-equity, Jules. For equity, there's a much bigger financial component, assuming that the firm is profitable.
So that's right. Why would you be an equity partner?
Because you get, at least if it's run properly, right? Mm-hmm. You get the profits of the firm or a portion of the profits of the firm. It basically you're a business owner of that firm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So in a large firm, I know people that typically base comp for, let's say, a trial attorney in New York will go anywhere from, I see ads all over the place, but let's call it 150 to 200. But they can make $1 million a year if they're getting a piece of the equity. Right? Okay. You have a good year, $30 million in settlements, $40 million in settlements, you're going to have a good year. So that's why most people want that equity component.
Okay.
Right.
So Ed, talk to me about, because this is something that there's a lot of confusion on too, and I want to clear the air with this podcast. I tell a story about somebody who sat down. I was interviewing a gentleman. I said, so what do you envision? He's like, I figured I'd come in as a partner. And I was like, well, did you bring your checkbook to lunch? And he's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, no one buys a business, any business in the country, without putting in money. And in the law field, especially among younger lawyers, there is a misunderstanding about the financial component of partnership. So Ed, talk about pricing, value, and consideration in partnership.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, partnership is a means to get a bunch of cash flow, right? So the business, by virtue of owning the business, I get cash flow every year, right? Assuming it's run well. And so you don't just show up and be given the ability to get this kind of cash flow. You've got to pay for it. It's like any other investment in the world. You pay an amount based on what the future cash flow is going to be. And that value is dependent on, is that cash flow more certain or less certain, right? So we start with the cash flow and then we decide, okay, has the firm been run well? Is this consistent? Is it consistently growing? Are there all the factors there that it's going to continue in the future? That's worth more than a firm that goes up and down and left and right and all sorts of places. And the cash flow might be zero one year and, $1 million the next year, right? That's much less valuable.
Yeah. And okay, so let's expand on that. So there's a newish website, Law Practice Exchange. Are you familiar with them?
I am.
So they're a business broker. Do you work with them? Is that why you're smiling?
No, they're competition, but
okay.
I know of them.
That's right. You own a business brokerage as well, right?
We do, yeah.
What's the name of the business brokerage?
Fitzgibbon Alexander Inc.
Okay. And what's the niche of that? Is it just law firms? Is it professional services?
Well, so my niche in that is the professional services side. So that's kind of what we bring together because we can do legal work for what I call internal transfers, and then we can do the brokerage work for external transfers.
Do you do the brokerage work across the country?
It depends on the actual state itself because some states don't regulate that. Other states do. And if they do, then we would work with a broker in that state.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's talk about then. I was looking at a listing for a personal injury firm in New York. And the purchase price was $7 million. So I said, I got to see the numbers, send me the numbers, because I was looking to acquire a law firm. At one point I was talking to you about it. And New York's a really challenging market to just do business with lawyers in general, because most of them don't have proper expectations of valuation. Okay. Mm-hmm. I think I said that as politically correct as I can. So $7 million, I see the numbers. I go, the salary number is really low. And he's running like 1,000 files. Turns out he has no associates. So he's working 30 hours a week. That's why the take-home profit is what it is. And I was like, I got to adjust all these numbers for, 10 associates to run 100 files each. And that started to really change the number, especially if you're working with somebody like you, Ed. It's really simple to look at the numbers and go, something's off, right? If you say you're grossing $7 million, you're taking home $5 million,
that's off.
That's
Definitely
off. I already know it's off. You're not having a net profit greater than 60% or whatever the number is.
Yeah, that would be amazing at $7 million that you had a 60% net profit. That would be shocking.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But those numbers also tell me is there's probably marital problems there because he's working all the time. He has zero leverage built in. You're laughing, Jules, but I'm serious. Like, you can't take home $5 million on a $7 million gross unless you're doing all the work yourself, which means you're literally working yourself to the bone.
Mm-hmm.
I had a guy that I talked to who, he wanted to sell the practice, and he was very, very proud of how many hours he worked and how he was available to his clients 24/7. And I had to explain to him, well, the problem is that you have to adjust what you're doing to add in another salary because nobody is going to work 80 hours a week.
Right.
They're not going to buy your practice to work 80 hours a week. And so we had to throw in some salary in there for
Did he end up selling it? Was he able to sell it?
He did not like the answer. So he did not go forward with us. But, the other problem with that is he really should go find the associate and have the associate in place for a couple of years because I don't want to come in and say, oh, yeah, I'm going to buy and now I got to find an associate. That's a lot of risk.
It's a lot of risk, especially in this market, So that's really, really an interesting analysis. The idea, I think there's two schools out there, right? Like you and I, where we talk about the business of law all the time. Some gentleman attorney posted on LinkedIn the other night, if a law firm talks about the business, it's a business. And that's awful. It's not what you want. And then you had guys like me and another guy out of New Jersey who I know runs it like we do, right? Who was like, no one wants to buy what you're talking about, which is working 80 hours a week. That's not a business. It's a horrible job, actually.
A horrible job.
Horrible job, right? Like you can't bike 180 miles across Florida, like you were saying earlier, if you're putting in 80 hours a week.
That's
Jules,
right.
what were you going to say, Jules? Sorry.
I think most people, when they think of lawyers, they think of the lawyer working 80-hour weeks and like being available for their clients 24/7. So it's funny because when you look at it from a business perspective, it's not the way it should be at all.
Yeah, like no one's going to buy that business. No one.
Not at all. No one wants to live that life.
No. And the ones that do are willing to trade their time for money. That's what Jules, that's what I was saying. I guarantee anybody's boasting those kinds of numbers where something's clearly off, divorce, distant relationships with their kids. Ed and I can predict it because we've seen it time and time and time again.
So what kind of people are buying these law firms? Like other bigger law firms?
That would be like a strategic buy. So if you had a small law firm, let's say you had a law firm in an area that was, I don't know, north of Tampa, and one of the Tampa PI firms wanted to expand, they would do that through an acquisition there. So that's one way. Sometimes it's individual lawyers looking to expand an office. That's typically a small transaction though. And a lot of them are internal. So you identify a key associate and you bring them on into partnership. And then as part of that, you've lined up what your retirement looks like because you sell to them in retirement. Now, there's a little bit of risk to that because if they leave, right before you're ready to retire, there's some potential downside to it. But if you vet the person and you bring them into ownership and you teach them how to be a law firm owner, those transactions can work out swimmingly well because the risk of buying any firm is that the clients they're not happy with the new owner. But if I'm on as an associate and I'm handling and helping these clients for years before I buy, to them, it just looks like, Bob retired and Jim is now the new lawyer there.
Right. And they already know the face, they know the name, they know the quality of work, right? I think that's a big thing. So I read your book. What does selling a law practice look like? What are the 4 scenarios?
The sale part is 2 of the 4 scenarios. So the first scenario is you die at your desk.
Oh,
yeah.
Say that again. Terrible. Say that again for all of those people like, I would never run my law firm like a business.
Yes, die at your desk, right.
Close your eyes and picture yourself slumped over your desk, dead. And your paralegal walking in and somebody like Juliet who weighs like soaking wet 90 pounds going to have to lift me out of my chair dead. That's not what I want.
I'm not lifting anybody in. That sounds like a terrible picture you just painted.
It happens all the time though. I interviewed a guy, Ed, who said, I died at my desk 4 times.
Wow.
Like, man, if that's not a wake-up call to do some succession planning with people like you, I don't know what is. That's actually what got me off my ass to start doing succession planning. 2 things. I wanted to attract the highest level talent of lawyers that I can at this point. And no real player wants to come in unless there's a partnership track. Right. That's one. The thought of dying at my desk after everything I've built and my wife having to go to somebody like Ed and go, I don't know what to do. That was an unacceptable risk for me.
Yeah, that's the worst part. I mean, you're leaving it for your spouse or your children to come in and clean up. I mean, that's absolutely horrible. This is the biggest problem is people wait too long. So die at your desk, right? It also can be, hey, I've got a terminal illness and I need to get out, right? And they wait too long and they call us up and they're like, hey, I need to get out in 3 months or 4 months or whatever. We can't do anything to help you in that case, right? Because this takes time. It's sad, really sad.
It really is. And what's most befuddling about it to me is we're lawyers. This is what we do for the rest of the population is not only solve problems, but plan for problem avoidance. And yet we're the dumbest profession when it comes to hiring an Ed or somebody like an Ed so that stuff doesn't happen to our beloved spouses and families. It's unbelievable to me. It really is.
It's the cobbler's children.
So back to your book, the number 1 was die at your desk, unfortunately. Yeah. And then the rest?
Number 2 is liquidate. So basically you haven't died, but you've got to close everything down. And that's kind of a nightmare too, because you got to time everything. You got to close out your cases. You got people in the office. You got to pay them out. I mean, that's a horrible process. Better than dying at your desk, but not good no matter what. And then the third is the internal sale. So that's what I talked about before, having an associate. And then the 4th is the external sale. And that's going out and finding, an outside buyer who'll come in and take over the practice.
Are those transactions frequent? And which is more frequent, internal or external?
Internal by a long shot.
Which carries the higher price tag with it usually?
If it's done right, there shouldn't be a big difference in the price tag. Right? Because you've planned it out, you've brought the person in. It takes more time by a long shot to do the internal sale than it does the external sale. The beauty of the external sale, though, is you kind of have a marketplace. We have a limited marketplace as lawyers because you need a lawyer that's licensed in the state and, per the ethical rules, competent to practice in that area, right? So there are drags on that type of transaction that aren't on the internal. But as between the two, if you don't have an associate, you're going to go external.
This is kind of going to be a funny question, I feel like. On these external or internal sales, are they paying sales tax? Like, how does that work?
It's a good question. It's not a bad question, Jules.
That's just what I'm like, oh my God, that sales tax must be astronomical.
They're done in a couple of different ways. One would be like a stock purchase. The other would be an asset purchase. And generally, neither of those are the sales tax due.
Okay.
But there are income tax consequences that it really does behoove, again, anybody listening to this who's considering succession planning. And if you're not, good Lord, just start considering it, right? Doesn't matter how old you are. You know, I know somebody who was in their early 30s diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, had a rebound, went into remission, but everybody thinks they're going to live forever. I'm going to be settling PI cases to my 80s till you drop dead at your desk, right? So yeah, I think that people need the wake up call of no one lives forever. Come on, get with it. And you owe succession planning not just to your family. You owe it to your team, right? Jules works in the law firm along with 24 other people and 15 people overseas. I am feeding 40 families annually. What happens if something happens to me? There's got to be a succession plan in place. It's not fair to the people that are helping you build something great, right? So I think it's a big component of being a thought leader in the space or a market dominant force is having a succession plan in place, a real succession plan that somebody like Ed has put together. So internal, external, you see more of the internal?
Yeah, more of the internal. Absolutely. Just one thing to carry on what you were talking about there about a succession plan. Remember, you don't have to have somebody internal. If you were a pure solo or a solo with a staff, you can do an external succession plan, right? You can set it up with another solo so that the two of you are each a successor to the other. So that if there's a problem, there is an automatic transfer of the practice and the team stays intact. The clients continue to get the benefit and the families can get some,
I was going to say the families get paid out, right? The families get paid out. I'm actually in the process of one of these transactions right now with a good friend in his 60s, got a really sweet gig offer. And he called me up and he's like, I'd like to talk to you about this in the new year. So we're going to be having those conversations because I have the business processes, systems, and people where he knows the transition will be relatively simple. And then it's just financial, whatever we work out on the financial side, right? And in that instance, he's just thinking ahead. He wants to be playing golf 6 months out of the year, and he can't do that and have his practice just not attended to. So let's talk about the hot button issue that you hear a lot of bad stuff about. And by bad, I mean inaccurate. How do you value a law practice?
It's all about two variables and two variables alone, right? The first variable is how much cash flow is coming out of the practice, right? And you brought up a point before that's important here. Cash flow, we can't minimize expenses that are necessary in order to maximize cash flow. The expenses have to be appropriate, and then you raise the gross revenue to get the right cash flow, okay? So it's cash flow, and then the second component is what's the likelihood that that cash flow is going to continue in the future? This is where lawyers get completely tied up on this because they figure, oh, well, once I'm gone, nobody's going to come back to the practice, right? And that's about having a team and a team approach and a marketing system and all of the things that any good business has, right? You've got to have that in your law firm. So if you look at it, there's two ways to do it. You take and you figure out the what's called seller's discretionary earnings, which is basically the salary and all of the benefits that come out of the law firm, right? And so in doing that, that's discretionary earnings of the seller. And that is, you pick a multiplier. And so that multiplier then is, okay, we throw off $1 million a year of seller's discretionary earnings, and the multiplier is whatever, 2.1, whatever it is. So I'm not quoting a specific multiplier, but right. So, okay, now the base value for the firm looks like it should be 2.1 million. Now we adjust that based on these risk factors, right? So do you have a good team in place? Could that team continue without you? Are you willing to transition with the buyer? Or do you have a good marketing system that works without you? Or are you the only person selling the clients, right? Do you have an intake person and all of that? Right. Once you develop all of that and that thing can run smoothly without you, it's a function of the the cash flow, and those risks really get reduced substantially.
And you assign analytical data points to each of the answers based upon what the answer is to help you either increase or decrease appropriately the true value?
It's not a mathematical science, but what we're doing is looking at it and we're saying, okay, well, here is a huge win. So for example, let's say we had a really great marketing system with an intake person, but on the back end, we were a little bit concerned about the team actually servicing the clients. Well, if I'm a strategic buyer, so I have a firm and I have capacity, I can work that in. So the idea would be we need to look at all of those risk factors and weight them in light of which transaction we're going to go in, what we think the transaction is going to look like.
Gotcha. Okay. So, you do all of this fancy math for the sellers, right? Before you go to market with it. And then you have this concept in your book called reality checking your practice value estimate. How do you reality check whatever estimate number you're coming up with?
Every business in the world, whether it's a law practice or medical practice or XYZ manufacturing company, pays for itself. So an owner or a buyer shows up and they put money down, and then over time, that the money that comes out of the business pays back the buyer, or if there's a loan or a note, it pays that note, right? And so the reality check is saying, if we come up with a value and then we look at what the cash flow is and what the interest rate is and how much we put down on it, those two have to match. And I've seen so many times, unfortunately, that a law firm owner would go to a consultant who really didn't know anything about valuation, and they'll come up with a number, and then we'll try to do this reality check and it just won't work. It happened actually recently when we're doing an internal transaction. When I look at the numbers, I can't make the payments and the net cash flow come together. And if they can't come together, if the payments don't match what the buyer has to pay on a reasonable note, it's never going to work. The deal can't work.
What's the formula look like? And there may not be a rule of thumb, but because I know somebody who did a really profitable transaction. And I think what you're saying is if somebody comes in to buy, there has to be enough free net cash flow to service the note as well as put X number of dollars in the buyer's pocket. Is there typically a formula of what that split has to look like?
Well, so the way we look at it is a little bit different. I want to return an investment. So if let's just use an easy number, right? I'm putting $100,000 into the deal. I need a return on investment that's risk adjusted for that deal. So I want to be north of 15% on the money that I'm taking out of the deal. Maybe 20%, maybe even higher, but I want to be in that range, certainly not less than 15%. And then the remaining cash flow needs to be sufficient to service the debt.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And you want that day one, right? So somebody coming in, plunking down $1 million wants to see a 20% return before they're servicing the debt. There has to be enough free cash flow to both service the debt and cover all the other overhead. Right.
Right. That's right. Well, so the overhead would be covered before we determine the free cash flow.
Right.
And so it's allocated to debt service and return on invested capital.
Gotcha. Okay. I like it. Sounds like you know what you're doing, Ed.
Interesting.
You got this down to a science, it sounds like.
I like this stuff. That's helpful that you're really into it.
So Ed, real quick, I do want to pivot to something else because you got this tech background and I'm a tech guy. What are your predictions as far as AI in the law? Have you been studying it? Have you looked at AI? Have you really thought about where this is going to go and impact the practice area, that type of stuff?
My take is that it's similar to the situation where we had those vendors come in that were non-lawyer vendors. I think that it's going to take over the lower end part of the market, but the things that we bring our discretion to, AI cannot bring discretion to, at least at this point.
Right.
If there comes a time when AI can bring discretion to things, we're in trouble. But right now, as long as you're focused on the higher end component, the things that you couldn't hire an first year associate to do, that's where the value add is.
Yeah. And so I'm excited about it, but you also know I'm an early adopter and I see the ability to create significant leverage with existing staff that does have to incorporate their discretion, their knowledge base, that type of stuff. So I think that's a really strong analysis. I usually wind up the podcast with one question. What would you say is the biggest needle mover in your career to date?
completely it's mindset. I mean, at the end of the day, it's being open to the possibilities. I have to say, I've been very, very fortunate because, and I don't know if it's just that I'm fortunate because I have my eyes open to these things or because they come along in my life. But at each stage in the process, I've found someone who can kind of guide you throughout what you're doing, right? When I first got to, and you and I both do Atticus, right? Or have done Atticus. When I first started practicing, I met Mark Powers. And Mark actually had given me some great pointers. And then I began doing a lot of work with Atticus, right? And, those little things that come up, your mindset has to be that you're open to the possibilities and that you're willing to experiment and do things that are really non-traditional because, as you know, the practice of law is changing so dramatically right now.
Yeah. And I'll be honest with you. I think that the constraints that lawyers have are so far behind the curve because they don't move as fast as the changes, right? So I'm the guy that's always got to go back to my ethics attorney and be like, hey, can I do this? Hey, can I do that? Because the changes are coming fast and furious and our profession just doesn't keep up with it. On the ethics side, on the guidance side, it's challenging. It's really, really challenging.
The latest one for that, for me anyway, is the whole issue of private equity and non-attorney investors. I mean, that is coming, right?
Good.
So we better get ready for it.
I want it to come.
Coming.
I want it to come to New York, and I want to call you up and be like, I'm on my sailboat, and private equity got a hold of my firm. No, look, I think that's why it's never too early for anybody that's listening to this. I make a distinction between law firm owners and law firm leaders. If you build it like a business, you better learn to lead and build leaders in your firm. If you want to just be a law firm owner, you're going to hang a shingle. That doesn't mean you have a business. It means you have a job. Maybe it'll even be a good job, but private equity wants businesses. Real buyouts come from real businesses with a management team, with infrastructure, and outside consultants that have been guiding it like you. In New York, I have an ethics guy. That's all he does. He does my ethics. And I'm like, guy is brilliant. I'm going to have him on the podcast soon because I don't understand how people will run a law firm without the stuff that you and I have had exposure to. And I think you really hit on something that anybody that's listening to this, if you're under 7 figures in revenue, gross revenue, let's talk about for a second. If you have not broken the 7-figure mark, the best thing you can do is join up with like an Atticus. Right? They give you the core principles. They show you a different way of doing it. And then there are other organizations once you breach 7 figures. And then once you're on your way to 8 figures, right? There's just different levels of stuff. But that mindset, that was something we learned early on in the coaching that we did together with Atticus, right? I mean, Ed and I, Jules, were in a group that was a powerhouse group out of Dallas, man. If they ever assembled that again, I might actually go back because it was like the Avengers, right? Like we would just get in there and it was just all these hyper aggressive business people. And we had people like Ed who could be like, oh, this is what you have to do from a succession planning side and give it a reality that it's not just theory. Oh, you could sell your business for 5X. Nah. Then Ed's going to give you the real breakdown like he did today.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So Ed, give us an example of a success story on a deal that you put together for a law firm. What does it look like when somebody does it the right way? What's an optimal scenario?
So you want an internal or an external?
Give me both. Give me one of each.
Okay, perfect. So an internal one, you've got an owner, typically a solo owner, who is, usually mid-50s, early 60s. They have a good associate who's been with them. The key kind of age range for that associate is probably over 35, 40 to 50 is really the best range. And then, so what we do is we come in, we do an appraisal. We call it a broker pricing opinion to figure out what's the firm worth. We put a transaction together. We sit down with the owner. We kind of say, okay, this is how it would work. We want to protect the owner. So we do a lot of protective provisions in a shareholders agreement. And then we bring in the associate and we kind of walk them through the deal. So they understand, and some of these are large numbers, right? So we're not asking you to come out of pocket $250,000. But what we're doing is we're setting you up so that you'll be an owner and get that money out of the law firm. And then you'll use that money to buy your interest in the law firm. And so we walk them through it. It's interesting because I have that conversation quite often, and I'll encounter lots of different things that come up. We just recently encountered one where the associate wasn't happy with the compensation arrangement. So we had to go back to the drawing board and kind of work on that comp plan and come back to the associate and figure out, okay, does this work? Is this going to work long term? Things like that. On an external sale, usually what we're doing is we're doing the same appraisal. We're kind of looking at how would a buyer pay for this? And then what are some strategic buyers? Who are the people that are naturally going to want to buy this? Let's go and approach them and get the conversation going with them. But also we can advertise it. But the strategic approach is much better than just doing a general advertisement.
And do you have a database of sellers and buyers like this other law firm website that I'm familiar with?
Like a list of specific people who are looking to buy?
Yeah, or do you just hit LinkedIn and start to do some analysis on, who the principals are and certain like is there a specific formula you use to find these people?
No, because we specifically ask the seller, like, okay, who's the competition in your marketplace?
Because those are the ones that would buy you, right?
Right. And who is competition slightly outside of your marketplace? Because now that's an expansion opportunity for them, right?
Okay.
And then, of course, we think to ourselves, okay, well, is there a firm that does, family law that wants to add estate planning? We look for that kind of commonality. So we develop a plan where we're going to go out to the marketplace and talk to them about what we have. But because the firms vary in location and practice area, and there's no specific list of buyers, like, to have a buyer or prospective buyer say, I want a family law firm. Okay, well, what does that mean? Is that a family law firm that's $1 million of revenue? Is it a family law firm that's $500,000 in revenue? What is that?
Yeah, it's funny. I have a friend who you probably know, but try to do this in a very discreet way, who was approached about a merger. And when I dug into the nuts and bolts behind it, because I said, I got to know what happened. There was no financial component to it other than what you talked about. Maybe this was just somebody who was sick of managing. I don't know. I just couldn't make sense. Like, where is the financial component? Is there ever a financial component where an internal successor or an external is cutting a check day one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. If they have the cash to do it. Now, an internal person typically is not going to have cash to cut a check day one. So what'll happen is the selling attorney will finance that first portion. Now, right now, under the SBA guidelines, if I'm an owner of a 10% interest in a firm, and then let's say you and I are partners, Tom, I own 10%, you own 90%, you decide to retire. If I own that 10%, in other words, there's not a note sitting out there,
right?
I can use that 10% as my cash equity investment, and I can go out and get an SBA loan to buy out the 90% on your side.
Oh, I like it.
So really important thing to be able to do there. Yeah. So yes, technically you're financing that first 10%, but not really. I mean, there's a little bit of a tax drag on it, but you're getting the money out of it, right?
Right.
And then it's the 90% piece.
And really typically there's going to be tax structuring with that too, right? You don't want to show 90% that first year or you're going to get hammered. Is there...
maybe not.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay.
Because if we're doing it as an internal sale, we're probably doing it as a stock sale. So a good portion of that is going to come out as capital gains.
Okay. So one more question. Okay, I can do this all day with you, but is there a scenario where, let's say that somebody can do that? If you're representing the buyer, aren't you saying, look, you need to phase this guy out. You need him to stay in for a certain period of time to earn out that 90%.
Yeah, that's why the internal transfer takes a little bit longer than the other, right? Because there's really three factors. The one is if we're having them buy in, you're typically going to look at a 5-year buy-in time period if there's no money down and the funding is all coming from the profits of the law firm. And oh, by the way, you have to have your compensation plan right-sized to make that happen. But then the other side of it is we got to bring that person into ownership. We can't just dump the firm on them.
Right.
We got to teach them how to be an owner.
Right. And that's where we've seen people at Atticus that are like, oh, I'm buying into this firm. I got to learn how to run it like a business, right? That's been a good resource for a lot of people who are like, okay, I got a buyer. Now they got to learn how to run it like a business. So they're going to run it into the ground.
Right. And that's on the external sales side. So if the buyer's coming in and they're using an SBA loan or something like that, that's probably a different story because the SBA wants you out in a year, right?
Oh.
But if you're financing that buyer on the way in, there's a completely different structure that we would put in place so that you can make sure the buyer doesn't run the vehicle off the road, right? We want to put in guardrails. We want to put in some protection in there because frankly, you're financing. That's your entire value is sitting in that note.
Right. All right. Listen, man, this has been an eye-opening conversation. I love it. I love talking about the idea that people can actually build something to sell like every other business owner in the country and stop being knuckleheaded as lawyers about, we're professionals. We don't sell. Right? Like that just doesn't make sense to me. The diet your desk model gives me shivers every time you say it. So, Ed, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Tom.
And so
Thanks,
people can
Jules.
reach out to you on LinkedIn, right?
Right.
You have those free resources, and we'll put all of the links to your social media in there. And I appreciate you coming on, man. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
so
all right.
much.
Real quick, what's the name of the new podcast that you're launching?
Law Deals.
Law Deals. And
I love it.
What's going to be the premise of the podcast?
Basically talking all about this, right?
So I'll be listening.
How do you put your deal together?
Is it live already? Is it live?
Yeah, it is. There's 5 episodes up there, and we'll release 1 a week, at least until I get bored, and then might go to 2. One every other week.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but no, that's awesome. I'm excited. Law Deals on Apple Podcasts, wherever podcasts are distributed.
I'll be sure to link that as well.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. So this is the Lead Counsel Podcast with Jules and Tom signing off. And thank you, Ed, for coming on. It was awesome, really awesome. Wherever podcasts are distributed, share this with your friends that own law firms or are thinking about law firm ownership because Ed knows his stuff. Thanks, Ed.
Thank
you,
you,
Ed.
Thanks.